Welcome to the first episode of Chapter 3. We're going to begin our discussion on psychedelics by taking a look at what's known as the psychotomimetic model. You see, before psychedelics were known to be beneficial for treating something like depression or PTSD, their main interest from the perspective of science was that they mimicked psychosis, hence the name psychotomimetics, and that they held the potential or held promise to unlock some of the secrets of schizophrenia. Today we'll be learning about the origins of the psychotomimetic model, and then in the next episode we'll discuss why it fell out of favor, and why, as I will argue, that was a huge mistake. Introduced in the 1950s, the psychotomimetic model is most closely associated with the British psychiatrist turned Canadian import Dr. Humphrey Osmond, also known as the psychedelic scientist of Saskatchewan. But we're actually going to hold off on old Doc Osmond for a second and start our story with a different psychiatrist, this one Werner Stoll of Switzerland. You see, Stoll was the first psychiatrist to recognize the therapeutic potential of LSD. This likely had less to do with any unique insight of his and more to do with the fact that his father, Arthur Stoll, was the head of pharmaceutical development at Sandoz Labs and was a close friend of Albert Hofmann, who was the first to synthesize LSD in 1938. After Hofmann experienced the first LSD trip in human history, he told Papa Stoll about it, who suggested that his son Werner be given some samples of the drug to study its scientific significance. Ah, nepotism. But let's not hold that against young Werner. As the Harvard historian of science Anne Harrington writes in her book Mind Fixers, Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness, Stoll was following a tradition of research going back to the 1920s, in which clinicians attempted to create states of artificial insanity, both in themselves and in healthy volunteers, using hashish and mescaline, the active ingredient of the peyote cactus. So clearly the use of hallucinogens to mimic insanity was not a novel concept. What was novel, however, was LSD, which unlike the others does not grow in the ground, and its synthesis in the laboratory meant that it could be disseminated at scale, for research purposes. No, but seriously, that is what it was used for in those early days. Anyway, after a few delays, Stoll finally published a study in 1947 in which he concluded that LSD created bizarre experiences very close to those experienced by psychotic patients in psychiatric hospitals, and that the drug had therapeutic uses for patients suffering from neurotic disorders. In very small doses, it seemed to open the mind to previously repressed unconscious material. If you've been watching this series up to this point, you'll know that we've already discussed how repressed unconscious material relates to the psychic realm. We saw this in Chapter 1 with the story of Eleanor Longden, in Chapter 2 with the episodes on meditation and psychosis, and now in Chapter 3 with regard to psychedelics. Okay, back to our story. Stoll also reported a particularly tantalizing finding. When he gave the drug to people who were actually suffering from schizophrenia, nothing much happened. This implicitly raised the question of whether schizophrenics' brains were swimming with some endogenous equivalent of LSD. Now, don't get too excited about this just yet, and you'll see why in a moment. But I found it interesting because it parallels a story that Ram Dass, the former Harvard psychology professor, told about his guru in India. When Dass gave his guru a massive dose of LSD, it had no effect. The idea being that those who are spiritually awakened are already tuning into those higher frequencies seen in psychosis and LSD journeys. This story is not without controversy, however, so check out the link to the Scientific American article that I posted in the description. Okay, so remember how I told you not to get too excited about Stoll's finding that patients with schizophrenia seemed unaffected by LSD? That's because some later researchers found that schizophrenic patients given the drug actually suffered an exacerbation of their symptoms. That said, this doesn't necessarily invalidate Stoll's research, as inconsistent results occur frequently in science. And psychedelic science faces an elevated risk of this, given the importance of set and setting, that is, one's mindset and the environment one is in when they take the drug, the importance of which was not fully appreciated back when those researchers tried to replicate Stoll's findings about giving LSD to patients with schizophrenia. We'll see another example of important but inconsistent results with regard to the effects of LSD in the next episode. You know which of Stoll's findings were replicated, however? The finding that LSD is a potent psychotomimetic. In his 2018 book, How to Change Your Mind, author Michael Pollan writes that early researchers reported a range of disturbing symptoms in their LSD volunteers. And when researchers administered standardized psychiatric tests to volunteers on LSD, the results mirrored those of psychotics, and specifically schizophrenics. Volunteers on LSD appeared to be losing their minds. One of these researchers was none other than Humphrey Osmond. Always the kind of guy to put his money where his mouth is, Osmond tried psychedelics himself, in this case mescaline, before administering them to patients. As Anne Harrington writes, Osmond realized with a shock that when schizophrenics spoke of seeing boiling skies, having strange beasts stare back at them in the mirror, and feeling menace all around, they were not delusional or simply talking nonsense. They were describing the world as it objectively appeared to them. In his report on his experiment, he concluded that mescaline, like LSD, reproduced every single major symptom of acute schizophrenia. Noticing the similarities between psychedelics and the symptoms of schizophrenia, Osmond, along with colleagues Abram Hoffer and John Smithies, formally developed what became known as the psychotomimetic model. I'd be remiss if I failed to point out that it was technically Smithies who brought the gang together, though Osmond seems to get the most credit, probably due to his raw sexual magnetism. Anyway, a lot of their work on the psychotomimetic model seems to have been founded not on subjective experience, where I believe its real utility lies, but instead on the biochemical underpinnings of psychosis, which to this day are little understood. You see, Smithies, Osmond, and Hoffer thought that schizophrenia was a metabolic problem, having to do with a malfunctioning of the adrenal glands, which when impaired were theorized to produce a hallucinogenic molecule, though this idea never panned out. However, as we'll see in the next episode, this failing is not actually what doomed the psychotomimetic model. The roots of that can be traced to the 1950s, when Osmond developed a friendship with Aldous Huxley. If you've read Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, which we'll return to later in this chapter, you have Osmond to thank, as he's the one who gave Huxley mescaline. Huxley in turn began experimenting with other psychedelics, and he's the one who introduced figures like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg to LSD. According to Harrington, it was Huxley who persuaded Osmond to work with him to challenge the assumption that LSD and mescaline were simply schizophrenia mimickers. It will give that elixir a bad name if it continues to be associated, in the public mind, with schizophrenia symptoms. People will think they're going mad, when in fact they are beginning, when they take it, to go sane. This bad name for LSD had been reinforced in the mind of the public, thanks to an article called My 12 Hours as a Madman, written by the journalist Sidney Katz, who had taken LSD under Osmond's supervision. We'll return to this piece in the next episode as there's an interesting twist to it. But for now, the damage had been done. For Huxley and Osmond, such a harmful narrative necessitated a change in public perception, and together the pair coined the term psychedelic, which means mind manifesting. Harrington describes a speech delivered by Osmond in 1956 to the New York Academy of Sciences where he debuted this new term. If mimicking mental illness were the main characteristic of these agents, psychotomimetics would indeed be a suitable generic term. It is true that they do so, but they do much more. For myself, my experiences with these substances have been the most strange, most awesome, and among the most beautiful things. These are not escapes from, but enlargements, burgeonings of reality. I believe that these agents have a part to play in our survival as a species, because the psychedelics help us to explore and fathom our own nature. Without giving too much away, I'll say that this speech hints at the key reason that scientists abandoned the psychotomimetic model. But you'll have to watch the next episode to find out exactly what happened and why, as I'll argue, abandoning the psychotomimetic model was a huge mistake. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.